Just want to say welcome to all of our guests tonight. It's a real privilege to be doing this live webinar, deFrost number 61 on place predictions for 2021. But first of all, I'd like to do a welcome to country and acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we work and live and recognize their continuing connection to land, water, and culture. And I pay respect to elders past, present, and emerging. As you guys, what's going to happen tonight, I'm going to do a bit of an overview of the night. We're going to be talking probably between 45 minutes to an hour. Towards the end, we're going to have questions. And if you can, during the course of the talk, just please add any questions that you think of in the chat box, and we'll come back to those as we go. As I said, welcome to the deFrost 61. Tonight we're joined by Fred Holt of 3XN and Phil Kim of Jerde, both global experts in the field of placemaking and design, alongside our head of Frost Place, Kat Burgess, and my co-host. We'll be exploring the macro dynamics of place, how attitudes are changing and how this is impacting strategies for all types of places for 2021 and beyond. And tonight, it's exciting to introduce two guests that we met working on the A&P Capital project, Quay Quarter. That project is a testament to how we all work and bringing a vision to life that's taken more than 7 years to deliver. It illustrates how we genuinely anticipate the needs of the future before it exists. It's been a real pleasure getting to know Fred and Phil, and I'm pretty sure this is how they met each other too. We invited Phil and Fred along the chat because we're interested in hearing more about the global dynamics of place and how these are changing in an era of unprecedented change. What Phil is hearing in Asia and what Fred is hearing out of 3XN's headquarters in Copenhagen. And most importantly, how they feel this relates to the Australian experience. So Kat will now let you know more about Fred and Phil as she introduces them.
Yeah, well, I've got to say it's such a pleasure to be talking to Fred and Phil tonight, people that I've worked with for a number of years and really have a huge amount of respect for. I just, as a bit of an introduction, I mean, Fred Holt almost needs no introduction, but we all think he's wonderful. He joined 3XN in 2010, and before that, he was doing projects in New York and in London, and he became a partner in 2015. So he's been with the firm for quite a number of years now. And I think what 3XN have become really famous for and well respected for is they really approach place as things that can shape the human experience. So they don't create kind of beautiful boxes that then people just happen to be in. They really understand how a place, how design can shape what people's lives are like when they're working, when they're playing, all of those sorts of things. So they have a very, very interesting practice. And one of the things that we really want to hear from Fred tonight about is the work that's being done by GXN, which is the sustainability and research arm of 3XN, which they've set up to specifically look into how building practice can become more sustainable and what are these kind of cutting edge technologies that we can start deploying into places to address some of the very important concerns we have about the planet right now. And so Fred's, at the front edge of projects. He's a really hands-on designer, and he's leading the 3XN studio in Australia. At the beginning, when I first met Fred, he used to commute out to Australia, but now we managed to get him to move here. And he's heavily involved, as we said at the outset. We've been working with him on Quay Quarter for a number of years, but now he's also the head of the 3XN project for the Sydney fish markets, and also doing a number of commercial projects for Stockland. And we're very lucky that we're kind of getting to work with him on a number of those projects too. And then Phil, another person that really needs no introduction, a really influential thinker. He's the managing director of the Asia Pacific arm of Jerde. And Jerde almost were the kind of one of the first firms to really start thinking about placemaking in places. And Phil's remit spans more than 10 countries. I don't know how he does it. He's a dynamo. So not only Australia, but also Singapore, India, Malaysia, Japan, and China. And in particular, one of the things we want to hear about is what's happening in China, because we're very interested in what the experience is in China, because obviously having encountered COVID earlier than anywhere else, they're starting to deal with it in ways that we haven't yet perhaps moved on to yet. So he's a real master of placemaking and urban regeneration strategy. He's worked on flagship projects like Roppongi Hills, which is a personal delight of mine to visit when you go to Tokyo. Langham Place, which is also, a really flagship place in Hong Kong. And he's really working in China at the moment to revolutionize a lot of the retail experience, which is changing significantly in China. So amazingly, Jerde has created places that more than 1 billion people a year visit. So phenomenal influence. But also something I want to kind of get some tips from Phil is that their headquarters is in the United States. And, we're seeing turbulence around the world at the moment, but also obviously the US is somewhere where there's a lot of change happening. So what we're hearing out of there. So a regular visitor to Australia over many years. He likes hanging out in the back bar of Frankie's, as do I. And we know that he's trying to get back to Australia because he owes Fred Holt something, and that's an ice cold beer, So we're really delighted to talk to you both tonight. He's got one there, yeah. So Vince, I might hand over to you to start asking some of our questions.
Cool. Thank you so much, Kat. Great introductions. And again, really, really wonderful to have all three of you here tonight as well. So let's get into the questions. And if you have any questions you want to ask, as I said earlier, just please add questions to your chat box there, and we'll look over them as the conversation kind of continues, and we'll pull them out as we go. I'm going to kick off with the first question here. And obviously, we've seen massive changes in this last year and how we view and use places like never before. Obviously, people are still discussing it. We're discussing it tonight, and still a lot of question marks around that. But let's start out by asking what your number one prediction is in terms of what will change for places in 2021. If I could start with Phil.
Change. I think a kind of idea which always, to me as a idealist growing up, which I sort of long ago threw away, is this idea of citizenship. So it isn't something that in our kind of crass world of development and fast design and trying to make a few bucks in order for us to actually work and then reinvest these ideas back into our cities. But obviously, during the year of COVID-19, I think real meaningful conversations have been conducted and are now being conducted for us, all of us, to reposition our mutual futures. And I would say that I work probably with some of the most aggressive and sometimes cynical developers out there. And I seem to work, like you guys do, exceptionally hard to try to find a common medium. But right now, over the last 6 months in particular, I would say we are talking about citizenship, our individual roles in society, how we shape our cities, and not just as branding, but in terms of the reality of how each of us can impact, whether we are consultants or developers or government officials, in really trying to craft the uniqueness, the beauty, the difficulties of our individual places, and how we're going to put that forward for particularly the younger citizens of our cities.
And Fred, thank you for that, Phil. And what do you think the biggest changes will be?
I think it's related to what Phil mentioned in terms of uniqueness of place. I think obviously with lockdown restrictions, we all started to rethink, or let's say start to appreciate locally authentic experiences. I think prior to COVID, there was every client that we had talked about creating authenticity of place, and that that would be maybe a more destinationally branded experience. So the brand was trying to associate with experience, but COVID, obviously eliminated that idea of destinational experience of place. In terms of branding, and so what we all started to do, I suppose, is appreciate the local environment a lot more. I mean, to give you an example, I probably didn't spend a lot of or enough time in the local community or neighborhood that I'm living in Redfern, but during lockdown, got acquainted with that uniqueness much more. The local cafe became the local grocer, and I had a different conversation with the person there. The laneway all of a sudden became an outdoor area for drinks, and in fact, one of my neighbors might actually be tuning in. If she's there, hi Sky. I had drinks with her and her partner in the laneway. So it's just, I think this idea of change and an appreciation for the local, trying to understand what's uniquely yours, what's uniquely local, I hope will be a change that we'll see continue through 2021 as we work our way out of COVID.
Yeah,
It was vodka, by the way.
What's that?
I said it was vodka that you were drinking in the laneway. Oh, and tonight probably.
I think probably tonight.
Okay.
So I've got a question for Phil. I mean, obviously, as I mentioned at the outset, you're working all around the world. You're based in Hong Kong. You're working in lots of diverse places. Like, are there any particular things you're seeing, like as we mentioned, China and how they're now dealing with, the crisis that's come out of COVID-19? Like, are there things that you're seeing that out of these different places that might be different to Australia, just in terms of where everyone is on this kind of curve of dealing with the COVID issue?
Yeah, well, we all of us look at China as a leader, but it's as also obviously the biggest marketplace in the world. All of us, 3XN Jerde, we're all over China. We're dependent on it in a lot of ways, but also we have a responsibility towards what is happening in China, because we've either been part of a solution or we've been part of a problem for the last 20 years there. So with the such a rapid rise in urbanization rates, we've had opportunities to fulfill needs that they have, but also they've been a little bit of a laboratory for all of us, particularly European and American and Australian consultants, to actually take ideas of larger scale projects and input it into the system in China. Obviously, they were first into the crisis, first out. And if you talk to my colleagues who are traveling freely and in most cases without masks around China, they are functioning 100% normal. And what we are learning out of that process is that the last 5 to 10 years of what we have been imposing onto the Chinese cities, it's over, in the sense that the glamorous architecture is certainly there, but the demands of consumers, what they desire on a daily basis, the fact that they've come out of this incredibly greedy period of consumerism that we've also kind of mutually fed, they're also coming out of that as a society also. So, we talk about millennials in Australia and the US constantly, but you would have to say that the basic average class of people in China are also discovering what leisure and wellness, health, sustainability are. And so even in terms of brands, all of the typical brands that have been so wildly successful there, they're waning. They will never really die because the market is so large. But I think they will be much faster to be able to adopt key principles for holistic living a lot faster than we actually think. So, really related to all of you in Sydney and Australia, you have so much to then be able to carry to places like China, because China will be looking at cities like Sydney and Melbourne and Copenhagen for actually how to create a life that is extremely holistic and integrated.
That's really interesting. And Brad, what about what you're hearing out of Europe, like with your head office in Copenhagen and, Europe, again, very, very diverse experience that's happening at the moment. Are there key things that are starting to enter the conversation that your office is talking about in terms of how we're thinking about places?
Yeah, I think Phil touched on it. More holistic view. I think well-being is something that's it's been discussed, quite often in Europe in terms of the workplace and place in general. And Europe was actually hit quite hard with COVID. It continues to take another hit. So this discussion about well-being, not only in place but also in the workplace, I think has been something that's been discussed quite often, and how that and how well-being actually is designed into the workplace. I mean, one example I suppose I could give is we just won a high-rise in Paris, and the discussion of well-being, COVID safe. Fresh air was something that became an active part of the brief. So our design actually incorporated that idea of an outdoor terrace or loggia space continuing to climb up the building. And the reason why the client actually thought that was an initiative that led to well-being is it gave the inhabitants of the building an opportunity to get fresh air into the building, but also an external space that would extend that floor plate. And that added to this sense of well-being, added to a sense of community. And then even, let's say, more on the mechanical side, I know this is boring architecture talk, but the idea of decentralized air handling units is something that's been discussed in earnest now, where before it was all about complete efficiency, mechanical, 2 mechanical levels, centralized mechanical space. But with the idea that, viruses, this particular virus is spread through, it's airborne, trying to limit the amount of occupants on one system becomes a very serious, discussion point. So we're having discussions about decentralized systems, fresh air, outdoor space, continuing up the building. And that actually then starts to lead to this idea of well-being. So rather than just think about architecture, workspace in a way as numbers or number of deaths, it starts leading, to a discussion about each individual's well-being and the community as a whole within the building. We've also started talking a lot about smart buildings, and not just in the sense of your microclimate, but also smart buildings to help understand proximity measures, movement choreography, moving people up and down the building at certain times so you don't have congested spaces. So these are a lot of the discussions that are actually happening in earnest now in Europe.
Can I just add to that? Because since we were all involved with this experience, I think it's kind of worth noting, because that image behind Fred, Fred's right, I think all 4 of us were really involved in the strategy of place, on behalf of AMP Capital. And what seemed like such a slog at the beginning of that conversation 6 years ago is so prevalent now. And I think it's a real a mark of progress that it is so commonplace now to talk about these vertical strategies and precinct strategies. I always say that Australia is by far the most evolved in terms of the defining the environment of work. It's codified. You talk about it in a more sophisticated way than anyone else, and you frankly deliver on a consistent basis. So despite the fact that I give 3XN and Fred a lot of credit for the beauty of what they're creating in terms of the architecture, what's inside of it in terms of what the work experience actually means in key quarters, and in trying to marry all various aspects of life, that life is blurred, that the way we move around cities on a daily basis and over the weekends is really porous, and that it's completely interconnected, I think is what underlies the Key Quarters project. So I personally, I can't wait until it's finished to get an invitation back from AMP to attend the opening so that we can actually see our theory in practice actually works.
We'll make sure that happens, and we'll go have a beer at Frankie's. Phil.
I'll be there in the back bar with you. I might even introduce you to some bands if we're lucky.
Phil. At Frost Collective, we're all about designing a better world, and I know a lot of organizations are as well, especially at this time. I'm interested to hear what trends you see ahead for designing places in relation to sustainability.
We're not the most known in terms of the technology aspect of sustainability, but we've been working on more passive solutions for many years. I think some of you know one of our oldest Asia projects, Namba Parks, which is essentially a 9-story terrace park over a train station that's connected to an office tower and a series of apartments. So we've been experimenting with essentially passive solutions, which in terms of retail-based solutions, we have the budget for. For higher kind of complexes, what we've really been pushing is this idea of a larger definition of sustainability, which could be more efficient use of land in terms of the verticality of being able to stack different kind of functions and allow blurring even to occur up and down. So a few of you have been to some of our projects in Hong Kong, which are 17 to 20 levels, where people think it's largely a retail project, and it only seems to make sense in a dense city like Hong Kong. But what people don't follow is that those kind of projects evolve over time, and as needs for society and neighborhoods and our operators change, this whole idea of adaptive or adaptation, I think, has really become crucial. And I think that is a fundamental principle by which all of us are going to be working. That things are not fixed in time the way they may have been over the last 50 years. Yeah. And even, I think the changes that we were all thinking about 5-6 years ago, these days we can't predict 5-6 years ahead. And so that means that the way we program our places now, maybe half of it is really on traditional terms, because tenancies need to be a bit more predictable, rental yields need to be predictable. But what you cannot predict is what average people want on a daily basis. And those needs are so affected by everything that's happening in the world and their ability to access everything. We're constantly and deliberately now programming for change, not just tenancies and F&B, but actually whether something can become a workplace for a period of a few years. And the idea, of course, of working anywhere, well, now we've proven that we actually can do that.
It's interesting. Sorry, Vince. It's interesting actually that you're designing in a way we're designing for opportunities rather than just a single solution.
Yeah. I know, Vince, you're about to ask a question, but on that point, Phil, like when we look at density as a solution to sustainability, I guess one of the big questions is, are people going to want to live in dense places anymore? Because absolutely a vertical footprint lowers your, environmental. I mean, in Australia, we're particularly bad at this. We think we've got a lot of space. Yeah. Like how do you guys see that resolving itself, that dilemma?
Well, I mean, we're very bad at marketing, but the fact that you said, 1 billion people come to our projects around the world annually, that's one of the very few things that we're good at marketing. And these days, this year, we can say, a quarter billion people come to our projects. As we come out of COVID-19, however, I guess the clues are all around us, and they can be in less dense cities or extremely compact dense cities like Hong Kong and Tokyo. But the great desire for people to connect, I don't think that will ever go away. And that initial fear factor that kept people away, and actually for good reasons, because actually it created conditions where we could beat COVID-19 to a certain extent. But I think what we're facing in the future is an evolution in the expectations that people have, and new demands that are being placed on landlords to provide great experience. Now, for the four of us, that helps each of us, because that's what we fundamentally believe that we want to deliver for everyone. And I think what it means is that, on the whole, the way we're talking to our owners is that you're not necessarily going to need less space, but the quality of space, the quality of delivery, of management, of safety concerns, and really also orchestrating the fact that when people actually come together, the needs are for different reasons. It's for creative reasons, higher intellectual content, higher social networking, and whatever it takes to create those conversations, that's what has to be delivered. So even from a typical landlord, I think they're delivering more than just a shell and core and somebody guarding the door.
Sorry, Vince, back to you. I think you're asking questions about sustainability.
No, thanks, Phil. And Fred, obviously, Kat mentioned before that 3XN has a research department called GXN, which I'd like to know what it stands for. It's dedicated to focusing on sustainability. Where are the innovations and research heading, and how are you implementing this in your work?
Yeah, well, thanks, Vince. GXN, the G simply stands for green. GXN was we're very pragmatic in Denmark. GXN was started about 15 years ago as a sustainability research arm of 3XN. So 3XN, GXN, they're one and the same. I think Phil touched on it, but 3XN, GXN, we always focus on passive sustainability. That's the reason for the pattern on the Quay Quarter Tower behind me for the facade, and the roof shape itself for the fish market is a form of passive sustainability as well. But GXN's primary focus, I'd say over the last few years especially, has been on all aspects of sustainability, from environmental to social sustainability. From environmental sustainability, we're talking about circular economy. There's their mantra at GXN is there's no waste in nature. Why do we have it in the building industry? And we know the building industry is one of the biggest contributors to waste and CO2 globally. So one thing that they're focused on is design for disassembly, not demolition, if that makes sense. At the end of a building life, for example, buildings demolished, not disassembled. The concrete that's demolished, it's reused, and let's say road rubble or road aggregate, but you're only getting 2% of the value of the original concrete, cost. So it's a huge waste. So if you can design the majority of your building using reusable components, almost a kit of parts, being a Danish office, you could say a set of Legos. Style components, then you can disassemble that, and then the asset actually at the end of its life still has value, and the material isn't wasted. It also has value. Another form of research that they're focusing on, 3XN, GXN is focusing on, is upcycling existing structures. Quay Quarter Tower was, I guess, our first attempt at doing that, where a lot of people probably don't know it, but Quay Quarter Tower is reusing 2/3 of the existing high-rise structure that was on the site, and then grafting on additional floor plates. So that saved, I think, around 7,000 tons of CO2. So a massive savings. And the building that we replaced or grafted onto, it wasn't unique. There's and I say unique, it's not unique in its setting. There's a lot of cities that developed around the same time that have high rises at the end of their life. So I think rethinking how we actually use resources, design for disassembly, considering the end of life, upcycling towers, is something that GXN is heavily focused on with us in the office.
I also want to add to that, just because I think it's kind of it's a little bit too simple to say, but if Fred's involved in a lot of vertical projects at the moment, it's not exclusive, of course, but 3XN is doing some significant vertical projects. We're a lot more horizontal in a way, but it's the same kind of concept, because I think the mixed-use retail centers in particular are done traditionally in a very relatively cheap way, except they last 30, 40 years. And they need to adapt on a constant sort of basis, so that as a true town center, they're evolving not just programmatically, but in terms of its uses. So the thing that we're doing, even in Australia, but right now I'm working on a project in Japan where we have to predict, not so much that there will be less cars in the end, because with autonomous vehicles, maybe the same volume of cars will need to come to these projects. But we have these huge, cheap, but relatively permanent car park structures, for instance. And in a way, right now, we're actually designing them at essentially double the volume, and anticipating that over time, finally planning regimes will actually evolve as well to allow for different types of uses. So Fred mentioned kit of parts or plug and play kind of solutions, where over time you could actually insert different kind of uses. And again, as the needs of a mixed use place changes, you can continually adapt at a higher quality that's really built off-site under strict conditions, much more sustainable use of materials, and as little waste as possible.
It's interesting you talk about that, Phil, because one of the questions I wanted to ask you about is this whole idea of adaptability and agility. And I think a lot of developers are now trying to figure this out. Like, we look at commercial offices that, the traditional commercial office people would be in there during the day, and then at night there's that whole potential asset sitting empty. So I think this idea of a more adaptable way of looking at property, can you talk a bit about that?
Only illegally.
You made me fall off my chair. I get excited when I hear about things that are illegal, obviously. Tell us, Phil, what are you going to lead us into that's going to make us commit crimes?
As I mentioned to a couple of you, I was webinars scare me, actually. However, this one I was really looking forward to because it's really four friends talking, you know, and I think a couple of additional friends are on the call, and maybe my wife as well. And you know, in places like Hong Kong, which is you know, that extreme density is what's really exciting about cities, especially like this. But they're not really set up properly. You know, they don't evolve, they cannot adapt, and you know, even though all the uses are changing and the needs are changing, physically or even operationally, it isn't flexible. So, you know, years ago, we used to take up multiple floors, like 5 floors of extremely tiny, run-down building as close to the central business district as possible, and then we would put in an illegal private kitchen restaurant that would be used as an incubator to launch other restaurants, which it successfully did, and then you would bring in friends to do all kinds of venues. And so at nighttime, all 5 floors would actually get converted into hospitality. During the daytime, we were just pumping as a series of creative offices. And it works. It completely works. And in cities, again, you have more space in Sydney, so you have less reason to be as illegal as we were. But again, if you look around the edges of cities like Hong Kong, these warehouse buildings, which developers fight extremely hard not to be able to be converted for other kinds of uses in order to maintain a monopoly for the higher profit private residences, for instance. You know, that's been in existence for ages. But some of the most amazing experiences, and Fred mentioned authenticity, are not any longer at the traditionally branded restaurants and shopping centers. So what people are really seeking are individual people with a very, very specific point of view who are curating, choreographing, and creating their own experiences, which is extremely unique. And of course, with the way we're connected via digitally, we don't need other people to tell us what's wonderful, right? We find that out for ourselves. And so people are finding all this out. And I think, you know, there's a few examples, and I'm doing some case studies around this where these vertical transformations of uses, it's actually being openly encouraged, and with some major developers who have enough of a supply of extremely profitable centers, they're now seeking what is next and how do we actually begin to provide these needs. And so hopefully we will be a part of that as well.
It's interesting because I was talking to one of my clients, and he was talking about now's the time for real courage as a developer, because you can't really anticipate what's going to be happening next. And so you have to kind of take a punt on yourself on what you think should happen. And I think this whole idea of having a less fixed view of what property can be, but also a more agile focus, is going to become more and more part of the zeitgeist of how we talk about space. I mean, Fred, I'm really interested from your perspective of how you're hearing, because I'm hearing all the time this word adaptability, agility. It's becoming a really strong flavor. How's that translating into your work?
I mean, you know, as an architect, you hear flexibility all the time. We want something to be future-proof. It needs to be adaptable. How can I change quickly? And I think, you know, the answer, and Phil touched on that, is you know, you have to start thinking about how space can work harder to do more. You've all heard me say this before at 3XN. You know, we feel that architecture shapes behavior. It's focused on the user experience. And when you think about the user, you're also then thinking about how they could use space differently. The fish market, I suppose, is one example where the auction hall, when we started mapping out the use, the actual auction hall, it stopped at around 9 o'clock at the latest, and then it was just essentially empty. So we programmed that differently in the fish market. So from 9 to the next morning, it could be used as a theater on the weekends, or a cooking class, for example, showing you how to cook the fish you just purchased. But another example, when we think of stairs, we think of them not as vertical connectors, but social connectors as well. So these things can actually work harder for you. The fish market is an example. There's these large amphitheater seats or stairs that actually lead up to the main retail level. It's used for events. It's an extension of the public place. It helps actually act as a catalyst for community activity. So we have to think of designing around not just one solution. That's the brief. Design a solution. I think we have to design opportunities, which is what I kind of mentioned earlier and touched on what Phil was saying. And that's how we design flexibility and adaptability. You think about its many uses, how it could be used over the span of a day. So it's less about changing one's physical environment kind of immediately, because it's time consuming and frankly no one wants to do it, and you change your mind by the time you fix it, right? Yeah. So it's about creating opportunities, I think, more than anything else.
Fantastic.
Well, one of the things about the inability to travel during COVID-19, I think is kind of a interesting one, because all of us find such inspiration from all kinds of strange things that we see everywhere, and we bring it back and amalgamate it into the work that we do. So, for years and years, Tokyo, which is such an amazingly bizarre and amazing city, we've all laughed at the capsule hotels, for instance, but in terms of the future of work, for instance, between ideas of true wellness and well-being and adaptability, I mean, the idea of having all these small capsules for brief respite and floating tanks and quiet spaces, all that's going to actually happen, and it's not going to 10 years. It's going to be just around the corner for the first person who actually puts it all together. And hopefully all of us have enough memories of all these amazing places that we've been to around the world. It may not make sense at the time, but I think the future is here. It's been brought forward at an incredible rate because of what's happened in 2020. And it's an opportunity for us to really put it out there and actually design a solution for people in the way they need to behave or want to behave.
I think as creative people, these ideas that we're talking about now, were those ideas that were happening for the last 5-10 years that just were just harder to kind of sell in?
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, for me, I have this kind of mythology in my mind that because Fred was in Central California, then Copenhagen, and now he's in Sydney, that somehow he has an easier professional life, a more beautiful life than I do. That's the mythology that I have. For me, I think I must be really slow, because it seems to take me like 10 years of discussion with one individual for them to finally, about a decade later say, I got it. I finally know what you're talking about, and then begin to actually slowly evolve towards this more, sophisticated and real kind of sense of life. So I feel very fortunate in 2020 in the sense that maybe it was forced and thrust upon them, but I think what has really happened is that the quality of the conversation has been a lot more earnest than before, and I think that there is a deeper search for meaning. It's a sort of strange situation, but if at the end of 2020 all of these companies have actually made money, I think that the natural reaction is to snap back to what they know. Everyone fears change for some strange reason, even though we're all educated and we've been pushed into a lot of different kind of situations. And I think it's a real opportunity now to kind of redefine those futures together.
Yeah, agreed. I think it has. Sorry, Vince. I think those discussions we've been having them for a while. obviously with the pandemic, just to give you an example, we've been pushing, for years, the value of fresh air and outdoor space and areas for commingling, externally. And now that we don't even have to convince the client really anymore. It's something that they bring to the table, and tenants as well, because tenants are becoming more switched on in terms of what they're requiring from asset owners.
Phil, what's next for workplaces? And will the office ever be the same again? I guess you're hoping it will be, but what do you think?
It shouldn't be the same ever again. It really shouldn't. Again, I'm gonna. I think I'm branding 3XN a lot more than Jerde right now, but again, kind of looking at a simple thing that I think it's harder to tell from the outside, but the idea of these kind of stacked towers, for instance, that 3XN has for the key quarters, with really a series of these vertical nodal points, and they really become social hubs as they kind of move up. And maybe that was a physical solution, addressing certain kind of changes to the way people want to have conversations in terms of work. But referring back to a lot of our conversations, they are really mini cities, and I think that's the realization that we have all kind of come to. So companies like AMP Capital and Mirvac, and there are others, but AMP and Mirvac are the ones I know best. If you look at it, how nice they're in the future with key quarters, but Mirvac with the new property on George Street. I think that's about the height of what you can create physically for places of work. And again, I think now we have to go back to the whole idea of software. One of my friends who used to be at Microsoft, for instance, it wasn't for security reasons, but everyone knows when they sign on to Microsoft that every keystroke is being measured. And he and I were having drinks one time and discussing the metrics of 40 years of keystrokes. And what you really find out is on a second by second basis the way people actually work, because every time they move away and the duration of the time they are before they actually come back means you can measure they've gone to the bathroom, or they've gone to get a cup of coffee, or they've gone to lunch, etc. And so Microsoft knows exactly how people work and want to work. Of course, with COVID-19 now, Microsoft isn't coming back to work physically until at least the summer of 2021. And so what does that actually mean when they return? They will still have their 528-acre campus, but the needs of it will be completely different, because I think half of that functionality is done more efficiently from home. The necessity to, as a corporation, to provide amenities and connectivity for people's home, because it now becomes their place of work. There's issues of insurance and operations and support that's actually going to be required. But then what happens to the Microsoft campus, right? Because suddenly the needs become completely different. And will it have to become much more like a beautiful boutique hotel that is completely catered? Because I think that's what they will have to do. And in more densities, we're talking the similar kind of concepts and principles, but done in a different way. So has it changed? Will it change? Yes, completely, and it should be. And I think for those who really kind of lag behind, the pressures on rents right now means that the tenancies are going to get shorter and shorter. And that means people have a lot more choice to go to the better managed properties, the properties that have better experience and sustainability.
Totally agree.
Yeah.
Fred, you're working on some of the largest new workspaces in Australia. What do they need to do to get people back to the office? I mean, obviously, people during this time, they kind of hated being at home initially. It's quite scary, but people have warmed to it. People are enjoying it. And obviously not other places in the world right now are in serious lockdowns and having a terrible time, and we actually, our hearts go out to those people. Here in Australia, we're kind of relatively back to normal, but people aren't coming back anywhere near as much as you would have thought.
Yeah, I think Phil hit it. It's experience and the what can't you get at home. I always joke around that what'll get people back in the workplace is all the litigation from people slipping out of the shower answering a work call, or the cost of an ergonomic expert to go to everyone's home to set up things properly. But I think what'll bring people back is actually the experience that's being offered. And we've talked about that quite a bit. But one thing that everyone talked about during lockdown, and is they miss human contact. They miss connecting with others. I think the things will change in terms of the workplace. We were at 4% vacancy pre-COVID. Now we're up to 16 to 18% is what I understand. So the owners actually want to get everybody back, but things will change. We were designing for maybe 90% occupancy pre-COVID. I think that'll change a bit. It'll probably change by 10%, a 10% drop. So maybe we'll be designing, around 80 to 85% occupancy. And the way that'll happen, there's two reasons, I suppose, why it'll happen post-COVID. Everyone's used to working at home. You can work at home, but there's that desire to actually get back to work, to have that contact. So people will actually demand a few days of flex time, a little me time. It doesn't hurt productivity during the week. And then through that process, as a result of that, asset owners have realized that they don't need as much space as they once had. But what they do have to offer is, that opportunity for coming together. And I think one way it'll play out in terms of just let's say workplace, and it sounds counterintuitive, but it's to increase the overall density within each floor plate. So we probably design around 1 in 10 now, 1 in 12. I think it'll probably potentially go to 1 in 6, so more desks on the floor, and then you rotate teams. And that way you get that camaraderie with your immediate team that you need to actually help with creativity, stimulate the working environment. But because you're rotating teams, you still have that proximity or that distance apart from one another. So I think that's actually one thing that'll change as we start to go back to work. They'll take up less space, but the density on each floor, at least the desks, will increase, but you'll rotate more often.
Fascinating. Phil, it's interesting, your questions come in about this, but it's something that I'm fascinated in as well. Like, we started to talk about it, but we're hearing a lot in Australia right now about decentralisation, about regional cities, that it's their moment, that people want to move out of the city. Like, even in my own personal experience, I live in the inner city, but all the things that you chose that for, you can't do anymore, so can't go to see bands, can't dance, you can't do a lot of things, Yeah. So I think one of the big questions we've all got is, what does this mean for the future of the city? Like, are we going to start sort of distributing population differently? Are cities going to perform different roles? Are we going to see a different era of cities? Because I think prior to COVID, we're seeing massive density. We're seeing the city like really rise up as the primary kind of typology of where people were living and working. Is that going to change?
My personal opinion is yes. I think it has changed temporarily already, but out of necessity, and that the software that actually provides support for their daily experiences is behind, and it's lagging. So you may live in a beautiful bedroom community, which is extremely relaxing and green and leafy, but it only provides basic essentials and not a whole support system for work and culture in particular. So I think, if we think about cities like, let's say, New York and Hong Kong versus cities like San Francisco and Sydney, the opportunities for San Francisco and Sydney are tremendous right now, because now companies have actually come to the realization that there is a certain amount of work, and depending on which report you read, it can be 15% to up to 50% of work actually can be done out of the office, particularly administrative, back office, more functional kind of work, and perhaps more efficiently. What it actually means is that this idea of distribution or distributed city, I think it's completely real, and that's the way we learn and find information, access information anyways now. And so whatever is available for each of these secondary locations, tertiary locations, no longer are secondary and tertiary. Nobody wants to go back to this idea of constantly commuting. And, I was frankly always frustrated with the lack of sufficient mass transit in Sydney, because I thought that was a real missed opportunity. And I'm sure that's going to continue to improve in Sydney. But what it means is that other locations around Sydney have as much of an opportunity to create their own local hub, their own local voice with a sense of personality that will make it desirable for people to, but of course, live there, but also then now work there. And I think that's what we're talking about, that it's a kind of bigger ecosystem. Our head office is in Los Angeles, which is quite a complicated city, mostly disliked and sometimes beloved, seemingly only by the British, for some strange reason. But if you think about the way Los Angeles really grew as a series of haciendas to small towns to eventually touching each other until it became this big megalopolis, it is one version of a kind of city. And if you know how to navigate it, suddenly there's an amazing amount of stuff there that you can actually access. And that's now what we're talking about. So if Sydney is essentially the hub, the spokes really have to focus on what they do best and really deliver and dive deeply into what is real, what is authentic, what is special about each of those neighborhoods. And so the value of the neighborhood and the identity and the desire to be in great neighborhoods, that's what's really going to come up. And yes, for most of us, for say half of us, we can work anywhere. Myself, I have to come into the city, no matter what, because that's the work that I do, and I love cities and the messiness of it all, and I will continue to do that. But if I have the opportunity to do both, then it's the best of both worlds.
Well, Fred, I'm really interested in your point of view on this, because we're hearing a lot of talk about major shifts coming through policy, like talk of things like a high-speed rail connection just back in Australia between Sydney and Newcastle, and what that's done in the UK of having high-speed connections between regional cities. Like, is this the sort of thinking we need right now, like from government and from developers, to kind of think much more outside of the box in terms of how we can solve, the way people want to live and work?
I mean, I'm always a fan, obviously, of big thinking. I think it's important to aim at things that seem slightly out of reach. It helps, innovation. It helps keep us moving. I mean, and then in terms of, let's say, high speed rail. Of course, connecting people is always a good thing. Shortening the distance of travel between places, so you can actually experience what's unique within, let's say, that environment is, big part of obviously why we travel. Going to the idea of, let's say, the high-speed rail and having hubs off of that. Decentralizing, I think, city centers with innovation hubs or hubs of any sort. It's something that can work for a particular program, but I think as Phil said, what's important is that you make sure that it's just not about that program. It's about creating a variety, again, of opportunities within that hub. Otherwise, it's you might as well be working from home. You're not getting that full depth of experience of place. So I think that's the important thing with decentralizing, is obviously creating a variety within the actual hub. High-speed rail, of course, in favor of it, but I think the focus still needs to be on local experience and how we can actually enhance that.
There's a really interesting and usually mundane discussion that I have with various operators, particularly retail, and the operational discussions are not that fun, frankly, but how they will operate their projects in the future, I think that's a lot more interesting, and it actually also goes to how people like Fred and I were trained. So we're trained in an extremely formalistic way. And I think the future of design and young professionals coming up in the profession, or people who are thinking about it in high schools and universities right now, I'm really excited about their future because we were kind of taught in a way where if you were sort of visually sensitive or visually gifted, then you were led into this kind of direction. But we're really talking about strategy and the ability to tell stories and the ability to edit film, and I think all these kind of skill sets are what's going to be required to be able to manufacture a framework for better life in the future, whether it's a neighborhood or city centers, an individual building, or a whole company. So the idea that design is at the center of everything, and design is not just visual, which is kind of the public perception of what it is. That's where I think we can be optimistic and invest into a better education of the students, certainly, but also of professionals and our developers and owners.
I was just Phil's gonna ask you. I'm interested in understanding what changes you made to your business, to Jerde, across the organization. Have you restructured at all? And what are you doing differently?
Yeah, my day job's pretty busy, but my nighttime job is even busier, and that has a lot to do with restructuring. So as a board member, I can't say anything, but certainly it's nothing unique.
Have another beer quickly.
Unique to Jerde. Yeah, it is really completely different because I think, and I'll just sort of put a time frame to it. The last 10 years, I think we could afford to be stupid and still make a living. And still be relevant and still gain recognition and awards to say that you are on slightly this side of innovation. And now I don't think you can really say that because anybody who's winning awards means it was a project that was conceived 5 years ago or 3 years ago. And that was really almost like last century. So what we're having to do is understand that we have a certain volume of business. We have to take care of that, right? Because we work with some of the biggest developers in the world, and they're really significant. And maybe it's a smaller part of the company, but with those same companies, and certainly with companies we've always wanted to work with, we're now talking about their future and the investment in learning how to deliver all of that. We can't just design beautiful aesthetics. We have to really learn how to think in terms of strategy, delivery, operations, choreography, everything, so that we can help the owners think through this problem. So this whole, it's not, we don't have an advisory services arm, but I seem to be spending an awful lot of time talking about that to build an idea that there is a way to deliver on this vision that we're being challenged. So that's where we think we have a huge number of opportunities to take core architecture services, but really invest in talent that we already have internally or people who we want to bring in right now to help build these new lines of business. Yes, but it's really more design thinking.
What about your own team's culture? Obviously, your team would have been impacted by what's going on, like our team has, and it's been people's mental health has been at there's been a lot of issues regarding that because of what's been going on. Yeah, and ongoing or general well-being. I mean, what are you doing for your team? Are they willingly coming back to the office, or are they still managing to kind of do both?
Yeah, of course. Because we have an amazing president in the U.S. In our LA office, the conditions are a little bit different than what I'm dealing with in Hong Kong or Singapore or Shanghai. So in our Asia offices, which is a good chunk of our work, I think we've been our teams have been really amazing in the sense of personal resilience, also organizationally. We've been able to communicate, understand. And we have the luxury. Luxury is a really crappy word to describe this, but having gone through SARS, for instance, immediately on day one, everyone knew what to do. We weren't waiting for news from the WHO or the Hong Kong government or the Singapore government. People basically, we just conferred, and then we basically got onto it. Went into our backup systems. How are we going to communicate? Do we have enough technology and connectivity? how are we going to adjust our hours? We're going to be working from home or coming into the office because it's safe to come into the office because nobody's there anyways. So I thought we responded in a pretty extraordinary kind of way. In the U.S. office, it's a lot more top down because that is our headquarters, and just the legal system in the U.S. you have to just essentially kind of go by the book. Plus, I think we all know the U.S. did not react very well to the threat of COVID-19, and there was a lot of confusion about what's real and what's not. So our head office had to deal with it in their own kind of ways. For the rest of us, I think we are, in Hong Kong, we started at the end of January, and we've been working in combinations of home, office, etc. And I think we're very understanding of what's actually required. The idea of permanent flex time, I personally have no issues with it. However, I am the boss of at least of a small team, and if I need people here because we need to have a quality conversation, then under safe conditions, we're going to have that. And we still need to have that, particularly in a creative business. I think we are maxing out with currently available or affordable technology, how many great conversations we can have. But I still will say that I would miss talking to my teams on a one-on-one kind of basis. Just like, I'd love to be doing this event with you there in Sydney at the Frost office. I think we still need to do that. And as much as we can, we are doing it. Singapore and Hong Kong have a travel bubble air bridge, if you want to call it, opening up on November 22nd. And we will very quickly test that ability to get together with some of our clients and our teams going back and forth. And I'm fairly sure that we're going to be relatively happy to see one another.
And Fred, without kind of disclosing any kind of board information, are you also rethinking your business in terms of what changes you're making to the business going forward?
I think the Sydney office probably got in line a bit more with the Copenhagen office in terms of flex time. It wasn't something that was necessarily followed all that closely over here. But I think it didn't fundamentally change the way we work in Copenhagen or in Sydney. I mean, with architecture, there's these intense moments of creativity and problem solving. Conversations, serendipity. That's all kind of agency or help that helps create design. It helps that creative process. And then the other side of the business is actually then presenting those findings. So I used to travel to Sydney prior to moving here. I'd fly 22 hours, and then I would be on the ground for a day and a half to present the intense creativity and flow that happened, before that. So I think similar to most businesses, we found that half of what we do can be done remotely for the most part. And the only hurdle that we had previously was just those that weren't, let's say, adapted to using VCs in order to present information. But COVID changed all that. It removed a lot of those barriers or fears that some clients actually had to have meetings and presentations over VC. So it hasn't changed our fundamental design process, I would say.
Yeah, cool. Thank you.
Just getting back to one question I'm really interested in is we're hearing a lot about governments trying to spend their way out of a recession right now, certainly in Australia. What sort of advice would you give them, Phil, right now when they might be looking to invest? Here in Sydney, we're happy we're being given $100, I think it is, a month to go out and spend on food and music and stuff, which is good. But I'm interested, what advice would you be giving governments right now that are looking to the onset of potentially an economic decline and where they should be investing?
Very unfortunately, I haven't been to Sydney in about a little over a year, so I don't know if I can give you specific advice about Sydney. But I think the paradigm is pretty similar in most places. The way that governments invest into its own infrastructure. It's self-perpetuating. They tend to invest in things that already exist in a bigger kind of way. So, if you're in Canada or North America, you're investing into more roads, for instance, rather than really great mass transit. So Hong Kong, for instance, has this incredible area of the waterfront now, which is a bypass road to clear traffic, and then in doing so, it created this waterfront park on paper. But what it didn't do, because it knows how to invest into infrastructure, but it doesn't know how to invest into the experience of people, because that's such a soft term. I guess it's difficult to break down, except for people like us. So they should hire us to do this instead of hiring, my friends at Arab and WSP. And they know how to lay down infrastructure, but billions have spent in providing physical space. But you cannot occupy it. A very small part you can occupy it, which is extremely popular. What it doesn't do is to really focus on the quality of life within a city. And if you do a simple matrix of what actually exists, it's pretty straightforward and easy to see what doesn't exist or what can be improved. And that's where money simply needs to go. And if government needs to spend money on creating the most amazing street full of food trucks, that's perfectly fine, because it brings happiness to people and it brings people out. And I think those kind of emotional issues are invested into. We don't focus enough on the metrics of things like happiness, except for Fred, Copenhagen, which apparently still is the happiest place on earth. The last papers that I actually saw, but I think governments have to get better at really understanding how people actually are, what they behave, what they actually need and desire. And as much as all of our businesses are related and tied to the growth of property and real estate, it doesn't just mean hardware. And I think it's the whole software side of focusing on people and their experiences. And and in that regard, there are so many experts. There may only be 5 to 10 experts in Australia who really can figure out how to create the most amazing mass transit system in the world. But there's a million people who actually know how to create neighborhood moments that will bring pleasure and bring people and traffic and economies and spend into every neighborhood.
What about you? What do you think, Fred? Because I think the challenge is it's quite easy to go, we're going to spend this on a road for a government, and to kind of identify that as a physical piece of infrastructure. But the sort of investment that Phil's talking about, what do you see in terms of where government should be spending today?
I'll probably echo what Phil mentioned. I think need to. Obviously, the fish market was investing in existing or in a local place, and I think that has a lot of value. It not only stimulates the local economy, but it actually brings place and acts as a community catalyst. A catalyst for community activities. And I think I would rather see investments going into local places. Refurbishment, adding new opportunities in these places, rather than, let's say, the large infrastructural project. High-speed rail is great, but that's not used by everybody. The public domain is something that everyone in the city actually uses. There's an interesting example actually in Copenhagen about 5 or 10 years ago, maybe closer to 10. The older I get, the faster things kind of move. But the Copenhagen government had a surplus of money, and rather than not use it, of course they wisely put it back into refurbishing certain squares, plazas, but also something as simple as actually just investing in new playgrounds around the city. And these were mega playgrounds, and these were playgrounds that actually, were fun and something unique. And that actually created a place and encouraged family activity, encourage community activity. So there's small investments that could be made in a multitude of places that can actually help benefit, I think, local communities versus, let's say, large infrastructural projects.
Phil, this is the last question before we actually go into asking some questions from the audience. But when looking back on the era in the future, on this era in the future, in terms of how we approach places, what do you think we'll celebrate and what will we regret?
Well, what we're going to celebrate has less to do with place, but I think most people around the world will be celebrating, including Australians, will be celebrating the U.S. elections. I would think. I'm not making a political judgment here. I'm just stating an observation. I think, of course, what we're going to be celebrating is it's been an extremely difficult year, but I think the value of conversations. I mean, if we can break it down into something as simple as that, I would say as stressful and difficult it's been, and there's been a tremendous amount of fear that we've come to live with. I'm personally heartened by how approachable, accessible, open-minded everyone has been to a really surprising degree. And I feel kind of as a result of the experience of the year that I now know I don't have to let my natural shyness get in the way. I can reach out and know that I can have a good conversation and ask questions and ask things of people which mutually benefit us. And I think it's, if we break it down to the simplest building block, it is about two people having great conversations, open, challenging each other, and then also mutually trying to come up with an idea, and then collecting as many people as we can to create all the forces to actually be able to deliver this idea. I think cynicism definitely can get in the way or used to get in the way, and it's always going to be a struggle, but I don't think that can ever become an excuse ever again.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, what we'll celebrate and regret, maybe what we'll regret is probably all the 1.5 meter X marks the spot stickers we can't get off the public domain. But we'll probably regret the resurgence of single-use plastic, as well. But I think, in all honesty, I think there'll be some regret of those that maybe moved out of centralized areas for proximity fears, or the belief that longevity of working remotely can actually work. I think human interaction and that proximity to others, for very similar to what Phil just mentioned, reconnecting with others. I think that's what we'll celebrate, and that's what some, I think, may regret. But I think the celebration of local, the difference between localities, and then reconnecting with place, I think, is something that we'll I hope we continue to celebrate.
Good response. Kat, do you want to?
Yeah, I've got a question here that's coming through the stream. So this is from Alex Young, and I think it's a question for you, Phil, which is all about shopping centres. So obviously we've seen shopping centres hit hard with e-commerce, and e-commerce is skyrocketing, and maybe it's going to be something we regret for its environmental footprint too. I don't know. But I guess the question for you is, are these shopping centre developers starting to think about smaller formats or different formats to counteract the tidal wave of people who now want to transact online rather than in a physical place?
Yes, it is. They are, but it's difficult. They're Titanic. It's a big old ship that's headed into an iceberg, and they know, but it's so difficult for them to churn, even though they see that they're headed for it. So there's sort of, I would say, two things happening. One is just hang on for dear life because they hope the circumstances will change. But then within, I would say, the majority of these companies, they have essentially like a skunkworks unit that is really out there, and they've been given license by the CEO or the chairman of a company to really rethink and reinvent the future. So we are working with those kind of teams on innovation is not the right word. It's really dealing with the future today because it takes such a long period of time to set up. On a practical day-to-day basis, what we are doing with those shopping center owners are really looking at the fact that, let's say, a quarter to 50% of their tenants have been devastated this year. I mean, really slammed. And so of course it is a huge economic hardship for them. But you know, I also keep telling them, yeah, but you've made 30 or 40 years of massive profits. So it's not like you're starving. So what do you do with this kind of money? And I think what we're really dealing. Yes. So what we're really dealing with is, again, you know, we've now brought up this word about 4 or 5 times. You know, what does adaptive actually mean? You know, and resilience and all these kind of good terms. And even in something as practical and difficult because of inertia as retail, that is actually what we're doing. Setting up deliberate zones where now it's not just about shops on turnover sales and rent. We're talking about event spaces and programming where it's a true town center, and you're bringing everybody out on a more consistent basis, not just once or twice a month where they spend a gazillion dollars. They come 20 times a month, and they spend less, but maybe the same in total, and they feel more loyalty to the place, and the relationship with an owner is much more deliberate, much more conscious, and connected. So this idea of adaptation is not just a word; it is really practical. It's reality, and it will also become part of a whole new economic way of dealing with shopping centers, their owners, and their tenants. They're dealing with much shorter leases, much more experimental. Let people die off if it's not working, or kick them out, and bring in people who are more vested into the idea of delivering a great experience for a shopping center.
Interesting. Vince, do you have any questions from the feed you wanted to ask? I've got one if you don't have one ready.
Peter Sharp, I think he's left, unfortunately, but he left a question. Might we expect to see the urban planning departments, governments, relax the way that strict usages are attached to parts of buildings? You can answer that one, Fred.
Yeah.
Our government's got to change.
Getting government to change, I think, is quite difficult. I think governments do change if, let's say, the asset owners have a large push to actually change, let's say, the local precinct environment, and that's actually being that's predicated on the tenant's desire to kind of create change as well. I think the city of Sydney actually has done, I think, a remarkable job actually over the last 10 years of changing in terms of its urban thinking. Sydney's no longer just a 9-to-5 work destination. Actually, the introduction of laneways, extended hours, all of those sorts of things, I think, is something that council and government has probably slowly worked on over the years. So government can change, urban planning can change, but it's not something that happens immediately.
I have a question. May I ask a question? It's a very simple one, and it's directed towards Fred Holt.
I think you should, yeah.
Yeah. So, Copenhagen,
yep.
Sydney. Which is the better city?
Well, being Californian originally,
and why?
Yeah, okay. That's not an easy question. Being Californian originally, of course, I love the climate here. As Sydney reminds me of 2 cities in my home state, San Francisco. The vibrancy, the culture, diversity of San Francisco, but mixed with San Diego's weather. So it's the best of both worlds. I think Copenhagen, it's a much smaller scale. It's you can call it quaint. I think the expectations, the reason why the Danes always are voted happy, or Copenhagen's happiest place on earth, is expectations are a little bit lower as to what they want out of life. Writing. I'll give you an example. Actually, my daughter, who's 8 years old, when I was traveling back and forth, picked her up from daycare, and it's raining. It's just there's a downpour. And I'm kind of cursing under my breath, and the rain's pelting her in the face, and she's singing, right? There's an expectation that life, is just a little bit slower. You expect these sorts of things in life. So Copenhagen, even though it's a European capital, it's a very relaxed capital. Culturally, it has everything you need. We talk about locale here, creating that local experience. that's just part of Europe. It's part of Copenhagen. You don't have to go to a place to get this destinational experience. It's just in your own, it's around your corner. It's in the precinct, in the neighborhood. So I can't say one's better than the other. I like both, and I actually miss traveling back and forth between the two. Although this year's been great for me, lowering my carbon footprint, so that's okay.
It's interesting you say that, isn't it? Like, travel is one of the big things that we all, I think, are mourning at this period. Obviously, appreciate the environmental lowering of the footprint, but it is hard not being able to just visit these places that we all love in the world, particularly when you're in Australia, which can be somewhat remote. But yeah,
rediscover your country,
your own home, definitely.
Oh yeah,
sure.
We've been going for an hour and 22 minutes. We've got 42 lovely people still there.
That's shocking.
That's pretty good.
Yeah. So obviously they're finding it interesting, which is really, really cool. But look, I just want to say it's been a wonderful evening. And I just want to extend a massive thank you to all of you who have attended tonight's event. And a big thank you to all our guests, to our two guests, Fred Holt and Phil Kim, for joining us and providing us such an insightful discussion. And we really appreciate your time tonight, and hopefully we can all have a beer in Sydney soon. Although I don't drink. I'll have a kombucha. And also thank the wonderful Kat Burgess for co-hosting tonight and providing such rich questions and astute answers. It was absolutely brilliant. Wishing you all well wherever you are in this world, and we look forward to seeing you again at the next deFrost, which is coming up in a little while. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Thank you.
Nice seeing you again, Phil.
Yeah, you too, Fred.
See
We'll
ya.
catch up.
Bye, guys.
Bye, guys.